Hi everyone, welcome to this webinar entitled Carbon Footprints and Measuring Carbon in Community Projects. This comes at the end of a 5-year National Lottery community funded project called the Community Climate Action Project in Bristol. And the Centre for Sustainable Energy has kind of played a key role in that project around carbon footprinting and carbon accounting. I'm Harriet Sansom and I lead the Community Action on Energy programme at the Centre for Sustainable Energy. So thank you for joining. So just to briefly go through the structure of this 1-hour session, there's quite a lot to fit in. I'll just give a brief overview of the Bristol Community Climate Action Project for those who don't know about it and what our role has been in that project. I'll then, before diving into kind of what we did around carbon footprinting in the project, I thought it'd be interesting just to give a very potted history of carbon footprinting and some of the debate around the use of carbon footprinting, looking at the pros and the cons, before talking about what we did on carbon footprinting for the project. So that'll be the first half, and then the second bit will be looking at carbon accounting or tracking, if you like, which was the other thing we did in the project, and just talking a bit about some of the methods that we used, when it was appropriate or possible to, and when not, and briefly on kind of communicating that. So yeah, just to give a bit of an overview of the project for those of you who don't know about the project. I know we have people joining from across England, so yeah, this was, as I said, a National Lottery community-funded project, which was coordinated by the Bristol Climate and Nature Partnership. And the overarching aim of the project was to demonstrate the important role that communities can play in achieving the city's climate and nature ambitions, but with a very strong focus on centering quality of life and speaking to the needs and priorities of communities. And with a strong focus on communities which you could describe as underrepresented or underserved within the city. And then kind of as part of that was really how to centre the voices of those communities in the kind of shaping and development of citywide programmes and policy. There are lots of organisations involved in the project, but there were 6 community organisations that, if you like, formed the backbone of the project. So there were 4 place-based organisations or community anchor organisations: Ambition Lawrence Weston, Eastside Community Trust, Heart of BS13 and Lockleys Neighbourhood Trusts. And they each kind of worked within different neighbourhoods within the city. And then there were 2 organisations that represented what we call demographic communities. So ACH, Ashley Community Housing, who work with refugees and asylum seekers, migrants within the city. And then Bristol Disability Equality Forum, who represented Bristol's disabled community. They were a partner in the first couple of years of the project, and then they were replaced by Emma Geen, who's a Bristol-based disabled disability advocate. So those were the kind of 6 core community organisations that formed the backbone of the project. But over the course of the 5 years, there was a total of 18 organisations involved, community organisations involved. And then the Centre for Sustainable Energy and Bristol City Council were kind of core partners. And then there were other kind of climate action support partners brought up along the way. So yeah, just to give you a bit of flavour of the different strands of the project. So one of the key strands was the development of community climate action plans. So all of the 18 organisations that were involved that represented a community in Bristol each developed a community climate action plan which kind of spoke to the needs and priorities of their community around key sustainability themes, so transport, housing, food, and each organisation kind of went through a process of engagement, outreach, workshops with residents in their community to kind of understand what the key issues and priorities were, and that was kind of consolidated into these 18 amazing community climate plans, which you can read all of them on the Bristol Climate Nature Partnership website. And we provided community carbon footprinting for each of the plans, kind of as a baseline to, if you like, frame the plans. So then the kind of six core organisations that were involved from the beginning then did what we call demonstrator projects. So they kind of looked at what was what were the key priorities within the plan, and they chose to kind of develop a detailed project around one of their priorities. So turning the priorities into action, if you like. And for that, we did carbon accounting for the six for the project, so that we could kind of track the carbon savings from those projects. A community leadership panel was piloted and set up, which was bringing the voices of underrepresented communities within Bristol to the shaping of citywide plans and programmes. There's some brilliant learning documents on that you can read about that panel. I really recommend looking into those. And then there was I'm going to sneeze. Then there was a kind of cross-community transport strand, which was developing kind of assets around how to promote a more kind of inclusive and sustainable transport vision. And then there was, again, this big strand on kind of climate and disability, and bringing the voices and the needs of Bristol's disabled community to the shaping of kind of climate related plans and programmes. Excuse me. And then across the whole programme was a strong emphasis on creativity. So really using the city's creative sector to support with engagement, communications. And there's a kind of a huge variety of amazing creative assets, if you like, that were produced as a result of that. Both kind of films, amazing light parades that happen in the city, sculptures, videos, memes, yeah, a whole variety of stuff. So before kind of talking about the carbon footprinting that we did in the project, I thought just interesting to think about carbon footprints more broadly. And what is a carbon footprint? We probably all know this, but just to remind ourselves. So carbon footprints tell us the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions released as a result of an activity. So it's called a carbon footprint, but it's actually, and it's communicated often as carbon dioxide equivalent, but it's actually looking at the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And that can be kind of captured and communicated for a single product. So what's the carbon footprint of your computer? An individual, so what's my carbon footprint as an individual, as well as a spatial area. So that could be a neighbourhood, a community, but also a nation. So, you know, the UK, we're always monitoring our national carbon footprint to ensure that we are kind of meeting our statutory obligations. And for area-based footprints, this could be a consumption footprint or a territorial footprint. And just to briefly go into the difference, so a consumption footprint is where you attribute the emissions that result from consumption choices to the community in which the consumer lives. So whereas a territorial footprint is looking at the emissions that happen within an area, regardless of whether the consumption related to that is to do with residents in the community. So I'll give you an example to make it clearer. So I'm a resident of my community, and if I choose to drive to Scotland, the emissions associated with that journey are attributed to my community. So that's the consumption footprint. Whereas a territorial footprint, the emissions would be attributed to all of the communities along the way of my journey, rather than the community within which I live. So that's kind of, there are two different ways of looking at footprints. Yeah, I thought it was interesting just to briefly look at the history of carbon footprints, and this is very potted and misses out a lot of detail, I'm sure, but just some interesting bits. So the 90s was kind of a key decade, if you like, for the kind of development of carbon monitoring, carbon footprinting. So in 1992 there was the Rio Earth Summit, and that was a point at which at the international level, the kind of the need to reduce human impact on the earth became kind of widely recognised and undeniable. And that was both in terms of kind of our impact of of fossil fuel use on kind of changing the climate, but also depletion of natural resources that was kind of happening at a kind of increasingly rapid rate. So in 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted, which kind of provided the first legal framework for international cooperation on climate change. And then, so kind of around that time, as it became increasingly recognised that we needed to do something about this, this idea of an ecological footprint was developed, and specifically a kind of individual ecological footprint. So this was actually developed by an ecologist and an engineer in response to this idea of, okay, how can we understand our impact and how can we take change, kind of trying to empower people to make positive change. And this idea of an ecological footprint to measure humans' kind of demand on the biosphere. So that was kind of happening particularly around our ecological impact. At the same time as there was kind of increasing development around how we monitor our carbon impact and our carbon footprint. So in 97, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, and that was the first where we had legally binding carbon targets for 37 countries. So the UK, whilst we had been looking at our greenhouse gas emissions from 1990, 97 was the point at which we kind of adopted a kind of legally binding target. And so, from that point, we needed to understand our carbon footprint at a national scale and track progress in terms of reducing the size of it. So we kind of had this individual ecological footprint developed. We were then having national level looking at our carbon and monitoring it and trying to reduce it. And then in the early 2000s, this idea of an individual carbon footprint became very popular. Suddenly you had tools and apps that you could use to kind of look at your own carbon footprint. And actually, research says that was actually popularised by BP, British Petroleum, to kind of promote individual responsibility in tackling climate change. And research says that, BP worked with a PR company to kind of really promote or rebrand kind of how to tackle climate change, which was to kind of push focus away from the supply chain and fossil fuel industry towards individuals. And this is just a little image of a kind of some of their PR materials that came out from that time. It's time to go on a low carbon diet. And then more recently has been the development of community footprint tools. So enabling neighbourhoods, wards, to understand what is their community footprint, with the kind of growth of community climate action and the recognition that we need to be collectively taking action, and how can communities be empowered to do that, has been the development of these community carbon footprint tools. And CSE has developed the impact tool, and there's also some other brilliant ones, the place-based carbon calculator, which was developed by Creds. So these are both tools that are just freely available on the internet, where you can look at the area that you live and understand more what your community carbon footprint is. So kind of having spoken about the history a bit, just also thought to kind of dive in a little bit to the debate around carbon footprinting. So the kind of the pros and the cons, if you like. So again, as I've said, in the kind of individual carbon footprint was developed kind of in a way to push responsibility and the idea of change onto the individual. And there's been huge criticism of that, in that there's the potential for it to kind of shift focus away from the supply chain. And recognising also that the capacity of individuals to make changes at the scale and speed that is required to bring our emissions in line with kind of statutory obligations, it's severely constrained by our carbon intensive systems. And this diagram just kind of evidences that, if you like. So this was a study that was done by MIT in America. The blue footprint shows the average US footprint, and the red footprint shows the average footprint for a homeless person in the States. And then the green footprint shows the kind of global average. So it's kind of telling this story that, evidencing it, that, even where an individual is actually making very low carbon consumption choices, or not really making any consumption choices, their footprint is still higher if they reside in a carbon intensive society. There's debate that by focusing on carbon, there's the potential that you can miss social injustice and environmental degradation. And examples of that are definitely playing out in our kind of marketization, if you like, of carbon offsetting. That's become it's becoming a big market as corporations and countries are looking for ways in which they can reduce their carbon footprint, and doing that through offsetting. There are offsetting programs that are kind of increasingly running the risk of, delivering programs at the expense of local livelihoods, especially in the global south. And then kind of on the flip side of that is the fact that potentially by focusing on carbon, you do so at the expense of the potential of other benefits. And also, of course, measuring any kind of data approach is complex, and measuring carbon footprints and doing carbon tracking is a complex process, and there are lots of assumptions that have to be made. So it's always good to remember that it's never going to be perfect, but it kind of tells a story and guides you in the direction of where you can make change. And then thinking of, why are some of the reasons why we do need a carbon footprint? We need to establish a baseline. We need to understand where are our most carbon intensive activities, and then to be able to actually track progress so that we have a sense that we're moving in the right direction. And that's at the national scale, but also at an individual and community scale. There's the sense that it gives kind of people a sense of agency and hope, if you're able to understand, okay, through making these different changes within our community or as an individual, I'm able to kind of reduce my carbon impact. And that's particularly important when we're thinking about climate change, which is a very huge issue, and people can feel very disempowered in the face of it. And again, whilst there's the danger that footprinting, especially individual footprinting, can focus on the individual, I think it can also be used on the flip side, actually, to evidence the fact that as individuals, we need to be supported to make positive choices, and that requires systemic change. So I think it can also be used as a flip to kind of say, we can't be making these positive choices unless we're kind of enabled and supported to do that. And one interesting thing, I think, which has definitely kind of played a part in the Bristol Community Climate Action project, is the fact that footprinting really evidences the correlation between wealth and climate impact. And we can see that at a national scale. So looking at the carbon footprints and the carbon emissions of the wealthiest countries compared with the global south, or kind of the global average even. But you can also see it at household level, at community levels, when you compare community carbon footprints of more affluent communities in the UK. The footprints are much, much higher than lower income communities within the UK. So having just kind of spoken around some of the debate around carbon footprinting, just to talk to what we did in the CCA project. So for all of the community climate action plans, we kind of created community carbon footprint information, which kind of framed their plans, if you like. And that was done alongside a kind of training and mentoring program for all the community organisations that we were involved in, and then other programme partners were involved in delivering, to kind of explore each of those topics and think about, okay, this is what the footprint information is telling us. What are some of the things that we can do to develop programmes which speak to community needs and priorities and are a more sustainable kind of step. And we use the impact tool to do that. So that's the tool that we made. And actually, when this project first started back in lockdown, we were in the process of the early days of developing that tool. So it came at the same time as us doing the footprint for this project. And we provided footprint information in both on a consumption basis as well as a territorial basis. And I'll speak to that on the next slide. And then the pictures, just to give you a bit of a sense of what it looked like. So, and this is just information that any community can get on the Impact Tool website. But yeah, so we were looking at consumption footprint, which is the pie on the left, and then territorial footprint, which is the pie in the middle. And then we were also doing kind of comparing it to Bristol average. So how did that community's footprint compare to the Bristol average? And then for the 6 core community organisations that were involved from the beginning, we also mapped information to the output area to make it more visually not easier to engage with, to kind of guide decision making around projects. And here are just some examples. So the map on the left, the blue one, is looking at housing emissions for one of the communities involved at the kind of output area level. So you can see how it varies across the community. And then the map in the middle was mapping EPC data, where houses had EPC of EFG, so the kind of most inefficient housing, where that was most concentrated within an area. The map on the right shows percentage of private rented housing, so tenure. So for each community of the 6, we did the carbon footprint information, but then we also mapped other kind of complementary data that we thought would be useful in them thinking about what kind of activities they might want to do. And I thought it'd be interesting to kind of think about some of the challenges specific to the CCA project in us kind of taking this carbon footprinting method. So it was quite more straightforward for us to develop the place-based community footprints. But some of the organisations represented demographic communities in the city. So the disabled community of Bristol, migrant and asylum seeker community, and various others. And that was much more challenging for us and really relied on the kind of research data analysis expertise within the research team, which we were fortunate enough to have, and we were able to develop methods. But it meant that our approach there wasn't so replicable. One of the key objectives of this project is to kind of develop and share approaches that other communities can do across England and the UK. And whilst it's straightforward for a community to look up their community carbon footprint, it's not so straightforward in terms of if you represent a demographic community. But it was a positive thing for the organisations involved that we were able to do that. All of the community footprints showed a lower than Bristol average for the communities involved. So there was definitely this debate around, okay, does that create a bit of a disincentive to act? The community organisations, had to grapple with how do they do engagement then with a recognition of that. Actually, that turned into quite a powerful thing for the project, which I will talk about in the next slide. But that was an interesting thing that had to be grappled with. And here is just showing it. So the graphs on the left, so you can see there's Easton and Lawrence Hill, Lawrence Weston, BS13 and Lockleys. So those were all the place-based communities, and then the Bristol average graph. And we can see that they're all lower than the Bristol average. And the map on the right shows where those communities are across the city, and that they're all in areas of higher deprivation. So yeah, that was something that was interesting to kind of grapple with the project. Of course, it's always challenging to kind of communicate this information in a way which is effective, and the community organisations wanted to use it in their engagement activities. So there was how can we kind of show the information in a way which is accessible? So using maps, using graphs. And we also had pushback from some of the community organisations on the kind of value of carbon footprinting, really speaking to some of that debate around, the dangers of carbon footprinting. So that was a really, what's challenging, it was also a positive thing in terms of kind of how do we use this in a way which really supports the objectives of the project, which is about how do we do, kind of community-based climate action that is empowering and speaks to the needs of the communities, but also shaping citywide policy and programme. Um, and so, kind of on the reverse of that, speaking to some of the pros, so um, there was definitely a sense that how we kind of showed the information was useful. So having maps, having graphs, having things that made it quite easy to kind of get your head around, so that the community organisations could use the footprint information in their engagement activities. Um, Having the footprint information on both a territorial and a consumption basis was useful for some of the communities who, really felt like they experienced having a high territorial footprint because they were hosts, if you like, of lots of industry and big roads. So these graphs show with one community where their consumption footprint, which is the two graphs on the left, is almost the Bristol average, still lower than the Bristol average, but almost the same, whereas their territorial footprint was much, much higher. And that kind of was an interesting point of conversation. It resonated with their experience of living in that area. So it was good to have both those types of information. And actually, the fact that all of the footprints showed a lower than Bristol average provided really strong evidence to kind of support shifting the focus of the project, from carbon primarily to kind of centering quality of life improvements, really saying that this is about listening and meeting the needs of local residents. What are their needs? What are their priorities? And doing it in a way which brings carbon reduction. So it kind of supported us to kind of be able to, make that shift. And kind of that also fed into, I suppose, citywide conversations around a fair distribution of costs and benefits. And some of the partners involved established this Just Transition Declaration, which you can find online, which the City Council adopted, as well as lots of other organisations across the city, which has a number of principles in it. But one of the key ones is around kind of how do we support a fair distribution of costs and benefits. And then, so having spoken a bit about kind of the carbon footprinting part of the project, the other thing that we did was the measuring and tracking of carbon savings for the organisations that did these kind of demonstrator projects. And before I speak to the detail of that, I just thought it's always useful to kind of stop and think, why do we measure carbon? And I've kind of spoken a bit to that in the pros of carbon footprinting, but the benefit of doing it as you're kind of doing a project. I suppose these top two, so it's telling a story of the project and the impact of the project. I think it's very important to kind of capture the range of benefits that a project is resulting in, with carbon being one of them. And I think that there can be the value of that speaks to certain stakeholders who, for whom carbon mitigation, carbon reduction might be a priority. It speaks to funders of the value of investing in community-based climate action projects. I think there can be the sense that community-based action might be slow or not at the scale needed, but actually it can be very valuable to say, we're delivering projects that really meet local priorities, meet community needs, and also bring with them a kind of carbon reduction. And for all the community organisations involved, it has strengthened their ability to kind of leverage in additional funding, with the fact that they're able to demonstrate a carbon reduction being a part of that, as well as all the other benefits that have come from their projects. And funders are increasingly looking at carbon priorities within their funding portfolio, if you like. So it's a strong thing to be able to do. And for some, it can guide project decision making. So if you're tracking carbon savings and you're able to see which kinds of activities bring with them the biggest carbon reduction, then that has the potential to kind of shift your priorities. Um, I've kind of spoken to this already, but it's demonstrating the potential of community-based climate action to kind of support our carbon targets and the potential to influence policies and programs. So again, it's kind of showing the potential of a community-based approach. So in the CCA project, um, the first thing we had to do was kind of to establish what could be measured from the planned activities. So there was a range of demonstration projects that the community organisations undertook, from training up energy champions and improving the energy efficiency of community buildings to training and upskilling social enterprises, setting up a community composting program, rewilding a neighbourhood, taking kind of food and diet and food growing focus, and kind of developing an inclusive and sustainable transport vision. So there's a whole variety of projects, and I suppose the first thing for us was to really say, okay, what can we measure in a way that is meaningful and where we're not having to make so many assumptions that the kind of robustness is reduced. And here's a bit of a simplified list of where we felt we were able to capture carbon. So where activities were going to result in a reduction in energy use, so energy efficiency measures, where food waste was going to be composted rather than being sent to landfill, where there would be dietary shifts. So there were projects around kind of slow cooking workshops, slow cooking programs to support residents to understand how to cook more healthily, how to use slow cookers, as well as a couple of communities also have amazing programs of kind of cooking and distributing batch cooked vegan meals to residents in the community. Where we could see if there had been a change in transport behaviour, where there was an increase in biodiversity. So one of the communities, Lochleys, did a kind of rewilding Lochleys was their project. So where they were able to track with the help of an ecologist that they had, where they were able to say, we've converted this amount of grass to wildflower meadow, or planted this number of trees, or set up a community orchard. And then another organisation, Eastside Community Trust, did quite a lot on repairing of electrical items and reusing of clothes. So we were able to include all of those in our carbon monitoring. But where it was more challenging was around where communities were doing stuff around training and upskilling and engagement. It was more difficult for us to make a robust enough statement around what the impact had been in order to come up with a carbon saving. So that was a shame that there were some bits of the project that we weren't able to do carbon tracking for. And then, so for each of the communities that we were able to do carbon tracking for, we kind of set up this carbon calculator for each project. And then every 6 months, we would check in that we had all of the activities that they were doing, and gave them kind of ongoing information in terms of what their carbon savings had been. And in terms of the method, so for those who don't know, so carbon factors were the kind of backbone, if you like, of our method. And for those who don't know, carbon factors are kind of used to calculate the amount of greenhouse gas emissions released by an activity. And they are figures that are kind of released, like calculated and released by central government, so by the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. And they update them every year, and they use their carbon factors to kind of calculate their national footprint. It's the kind of standard method for calculating carbon. So whilst there are lots of assumptions that will go into that, that's what we've used in our method. And a carbon factor can be multiplied by usage or quantity to kind of calculate the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent which is emitted when, for example, a certain amount of fuel is burnt, or a certain amount of electricity is used, or a vehicle travels a certain distance, or a certain amount of money is spent. And just to give you a couple of case studies, so Heart of BS13 was one of the community organisations, and they set up an amazing community composting project. So here in the picture is Jenny, the community composter, with her cargo bike that she uses to collect compost from houses and businesses. And behind her is also the Rydan, which is their big kind of composter. So this is one of the projects that we were calculating carbon savings for. And so the first thing that we did was to make sure that we knew what information we needed from them, and they were easily able to capture it for us. So for that project, it was about them just monitoring the number of buckets of compost that they were collecting, with us establishing a kind of standard weight of a bucket. And then we made some assumptions. So we made the assumption that all food waste is composted, would otherwise be sent to landfill. We knew, because they told us, that the compost that they were creating was offsetting their need to buy compost for their farm and their flower farm and community garden. And then we looked up the relevant carbon factors. So we went on to the waste disposal section of the government's carbon factors, and we found the section which is around organic waste. And we can see here the different carbon factors of what's the carbon impact of processing food waste, where you combust it, you compost it, you landfill, or you anaerobic digest it. And we can see here that, the carbon impact of landfilling food waste is huge, much greater, 626, compared to if you compost it or you process it via an anaerobic digester. So we were able to kind of, multiply the weight of the compost with the carbon factor to be able to track how much carbon was being saved. And we also created a little calculator for BS13 to use so that they could just use it going forward and track it for themselves. And then another case study was Eastside Community Trust. They are an anchor organisation based in Easton and Lawrence Hill area of the city, and they did an activity with a focus on energy and kind of reuse and repair. So for their repair cafes, we again kind of made sure we understood what type of information we needed from them. So the type and the number of items repaired, kind of the degree to which items were repaired. And again, we made some assumptions. So we assumed that a new item would have been purchased in the absence of it being fixed. And for partial fixes, we kind of made the assumption that the item would last about half of its intended lifespan. And then we again went to the carbon factors, the national carbon factors, and kind of applied them to the value of the items that were fixed. So this is a bit of a table just showing you some of the items, an assumed value that we kind of developed through an average, doing research on how much items cost, what the carbon factor is for the pounds spent on these types of items, and therefore what's the carbon impact of that item, and therefore what's the saving from the fact that a new item doesn't have to be purchased. Just to say, we'll be creating a bit of a guidance document for this project, which will kind of bring this out in more detail, and we can email that to everybody who's signed up to this. And then, of course, there was the challenge of kind of how you communicate that. And this was pre having easy AI tools, but we created a kind of Excel infographic tool so that the community organisations could plug in the carbon savings, and they could have these infographics which they could use to kind of more easily communicate what does this tonnage of carbon mean anyway, in relation to, oh, this means, planting this number of trees or reducing this number of miles driven. And then I thought, just briefly before I finish, just kind of some reflections of what we want to take forward. So really wanting, going forward in this type of work, kind of bringing a broader focus on measuring both nature gain as well as more rigorous measuring of other benefits alongside carbon. So kind of taking a holistic approach to how we measure the positive impact of a project. Mapping carbon footprinting information alongside other climate climate risk related, really, data. So risk to overheating, risk of flood risk, increase in exposure to wind-driven rain. So kind of doing a bit more of a holistic mapping approach for these community climate action projects. And then looking at how we can, develop our approaches to measuring the carbon footprints for the demographic communities. So that was a real whistle-stop tour. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, please do email me, and I'll send an email out to everybody who signed up with the resources that we've developed. So thank you very much.